Greetings, adventurer. Welcome to the Ocean County Library's Forge Your Imagination, a guide to immersive world building all-in-one podcast episode. This episode will be a condensed version of all the previous episodes recorded within just one easy-to-digest, on-the-go alternative. This is a podcast compilation that will point creative individuals in the right direction when attempting to create your own world. I'm your host, Tom, a world-building enthusiast and professional dungeon master with over 14 years of experience. This podcast series should be helpful and informative, stoking the fire within all of you worthwhile adventurers. Now, let's strike while the iron is hot and plunge right on into it. First, let me address the immediate questions you probably all have. Question 1. Why should I listen to this podcast? Well, the purpose of listening to this podcast is to help you adventurers narrow down the information you need when it comes to world building and book writing. This podcast will become a crucial stepping stone to exposing the roots of world building and assist you in making a strong foundation for your story to build upon. Question 2. What will you get from this podcast? In this podcast series, you will learn how to build your own universe. I will be covering a variety of different topics like how to select a genre and timeline, climate creation, common mistakes during world building, classifications of people, beliefs, cultures, morality, map making, how to create cities, currency, and more, as well as extended lore for adventurers who really want to dig deep, like creating names of arcane academies and school structures, classifications and rankings of animal companions, prominent world figures, ancestry, and more. Now, you are all likely thinking, why should I listen to this guy? What makes him qualified to give any advice? So that leads us to question 3. Who am I? Well, I'm a professional dungeon master or game master, depending on what title you prefer, otherwise known as a DM or GM. I've been a dungeon master for over 14 years now. And it all started when I was 12. My friend's father offered to run a Dungeons & Dragons game for us. It was short, chaotic, and a carefree campaign with 3 2-hour sessions. But that's all that it took to get me hooked. After that, I started looking into how to play and where to find a group. But as many Dungeons & Dragons players know, these options tend to be scarce. It's not like now where you could use the internet and connect with different groups and new parties and individuals. However, if you're a teen, 12 to 18 years old, and you're interested in joining a Dungeons & Dragons group but don't know where to look no further. The library has a variety of different groups to choose from, like the Berkeley, Brick, Lacey, Point Pleasant Beach, and Toms River branch. If you have the time, I strongly encourage you to look over our Ocean County Library calendar of events at theoceancountylibrary.org. But back then, I decided the only option available to me was to make my own group with my friends who had never played before. There were a lot of ups and downs, and the game wasn't for everyone, but I definitely found my calling. I became the forever DM for our group of friends, and this has just continued to grow and change over the years. Since then, I've run multiple self-made campaigns and one-offs over the years. I've never personally used a pre-made campaign, but I would definitely encourage new or aspiring DMs to use them for inspiration. They're a great asset to help building your own themes and plot twists. Over the years, I've created 2 universes with crucial world-building lore. My first universe is Akijan. This is a universe on Google Docs that's over 135 pages. This is my first try at a world, and it's just a normal high fantasy D&D world. It totals about 41,000 words if I round down. The second universe I've created is Solera. It's 132 pages. This is a world that ties in fantasy and reality together. It's a world where magic and technology coincide, and new players get to learn magic in our current time period and tame familiars like trolls, velociraptors, and dragons. This one ends up totaling about 31,000 words if I round down. Once again, this is the size of a novella, however, it's much shorter than the first world I've created. The world of Solera is actually a world that I thought it would be fun to write a book series in. It's something I've been considering and fleshing out more as time goes on. I just recently completed a list of prominent magical locations that include arcane domains, which are dangerous areas in the world that are supercharged with raw magic that the human body is unable to process. I would like to say to everyone who wants to write a book and do world building, has a brilliant mind and a knack for creative writing and storytelling. However, that's not always reality. I've tried my hand at book writing and self published it, but I hate even thinking about it. It's something I never mention and that I actively try to hide from most people. This book was a terrible example of my skills and made me incredibly unhappy. It pointed out crucial writing flaws and showed I rushed through them without building upon the proper foundations. I'm not telling you this to discourage you, adventurers. I just want to let you know that no matter where you stand, you always have room to grow. Even if you have great plot and seemingly good characters to work with, it could still fall short if you fail to world build in advance. My universe was so shallow that I was ignorant and I forgot to create guidelines or specific world lore to actually tie in. There were no laws, no administration, no beliefs, and no one to tie in these pivotal pieces of information organically. Writing is for most people something that I think doesn't come easy. It's a commitment and often a struggle for those who lack willpower and the drive to complete what they've started. However, with that struggle comes experience and knowledge that will elevate you to a higher standard. Now that I have built upon my universe with all the necessities and laws, I feel much more comfortable and confident to take another crack at book writing. I do plan on trying to finish any world building aspect that I could possibly think of before starting it back up, but that's definitely something I want to try my hand at again. Jumping right on into world creation, we need to establish 3 key details. The first key detail we will be deciding will shape what kind of world is desired. Key detail number 1 is genre. Whether the world is non-fiction, fantasy, or sci-fi will change the theme and natural traits of the world around it. Non-fiction. This genre is built upon facts and historical information. Non-fiction world building is technically already completed, but it's up to you to do your research and find the truth. In this genre, not much is needed in the case of world building. For example, let's say the main character lives in Plumstead, New Jersey. If they were supposed to take a long and perilous journey to a new location and you chose Tom's River, you would know that second location isn't very far, so this might not be the location you want to pick at all. In fact, by car ride, it would only be a 36-minute drive. That's why looking at a map is crucial for nonfiction writing and world building. It's always good to have in mind what nearby cities are and the distance between them would be. Another good thing about nonfiction, though, is that you could research the laws around the desired time period that you want to write in. That information might give insight into why people made those decisions in that timeline. For example, if you use the nationwide prohibition law and time period, this would explain why your main character as a police officer was often busy making arrests on the daily. This also gives you the chance to provide a more in-depth building to your characters. Maybe your character doesn't believe in arresting people for something that they believe shouldn't be illegal. Then we come down to fiction. Fiction comes in all different shapes and subgenres. A few of my favorites when it comes to world building would have to be high fantasy, low fantasy, magic realism, and science fiction. We'll start with high fantasy. This is where the realm of fantasy is wild, where imagination reigns supreme and reality is thrown to the wind. The impossible becomes possible, and the supernatural runs amok. In this case, anything is possible unless you as the world builder decide otherwise. This way you could create a high fantasy world that is entirely its own world and has no connection to the earth or to our version of reality. This is one of my favorites that I love to read and write. A great example of this would be Lord of the Rings. Any writer could see just how much work was put into this world, and the characters that appear in J.R.R. Tolkien's expertly crafted nations, magical beasts, classifications of people, and intricate political standpoints. This example is one of the many that we have at the Ocean County Library. For Lord of the Rings, we actually have the books, DVDs, playaways, ebooks on Libby and Hoopla, as well as the game Lego Lord of the Rings for patrons to check out and borrow. Please keep in mind, all of the titles mentioned in today's episode will be available to borrow at the Ocean County Library. Now, let's move to low fantasy. This is where you merge reality and fantasy. It's a blend of both magic elements like spells and creatures in that universe, as well as reality. A good time to use this subgenre would be if you wanted to use the world we live in as a base. So in this case, you would already have a map created, as well as people and their belief systems. This would allow you to have more time to build a plot, and less time would be needed to be spent on making laws and complex administrations. A few examples of this would be Harry Potter and Percy Jackson. Both of these universes use the Earth as a base location, but they also include various magical locations that are hidden within the real world. This is what ties together what humans see versus what the magical community sees. These are really fun. One of my favorites because, history of one side could technically be translated into another. For example, when the United States had its prohibition, the magical community most likely had something to do with it. For example, Solera, the one universe I spoke about before that I created, I use a low fantasy setting. So I use that to make parallels between the worlds. So for mine, I wrote down that it never came as a surprise to the magical community when the United States banned the distribution of alcohol. This time, the issue started on the magical side. It was a huge scandal that almost uprooted the magical markets. See, there is a special drink called Mystic Mirage that mages love and use as their primary drink of choice for get-togethers and parties. No one other than the manufacturer knew what was in this drink, and no one questioned it until the emergence of ectopox. This was an epidemic of mysterious properties. It would make those sick individuals unable to control whether they stayed a solid mass or became corporeal real. It was luckily only a temporary issue that would fix itself over time, but regardless, an investigation was made to find the cause of this illness. But in the end, they were able to track it back to one processing plant. See, the prostasis, which for clarification are my world's version of police, who busted them, realized that the drink was made with a special brewing component called ectoplasm. It was discovered that ectoplasm can be harvested from specific ghosts with abnormally high emotions. However, the company in question was forcing ghosts into emotional breakdowns through any means necessary, like making them afraid or sad, which was the easiest emotions to evoke. Using this method, they would produce ectoplasm that'd be more of a sapphire-colored slime instead of the safe, opaque color scheme. After this came to light, the drink was banned by the prostasis. They began to research how the sickness came to be. However, the magical community refused to be deprived of their favorite drinks. They began smuggling the drink any way they could, including using mortalis forms of travel. For clarification, mortalis is my version of mortal, which combines the two words mortal and humanus. This forced the prostasis to shut down the distribution of mortalis alcohol, which caused a spark of outrage in their realm. Finally, after 13 years of research, they discovered that anything other than opaque ectoplasm had an adverse effect on living bodies. The drink was then cleared and continued to produce. However, they needed to pay a hefty fine and only use the opaque ectoplasm in the future. Next up is magic realism. This is very similar to low fantasy. However, the main differences between low fantasy and magic realism is that the magical effects are considered as a normal part of everyday life. See, no one's supposed to question the magic effects in magic realism. It's seen as normal by the world. Whereas like Harry Potter, they end up trying to hide magic from the world of mortals. And then lastly, we have science fiction. This genre is all about futuristic concepts. This could be conveyed in multiple ways, usually with advances in technology, science, space, and exploration. This genre also comes with a variety of subgenres, my personal favorites being cyberpunk and steampunk. Science fiction has a lot to cover because you aren't in charge of building just one world. In this case, you would be often creating a minimum of 2 worlds with their own quirks and specialities. A great example of this would be Star Trek. Or you could combine fantasy and sci-fi, like Star Wars and Stormdancer do. In this version, you would have some magical powers and beasts, as well as science and high-tech gadgets. Regardless of what genre and subgenre you decide on, it'll be easier for you as the creator to keep the world on track if you decide this first. After you decide that, it'll help create a general guideline of what's possible and not possible for your world. In sci-fi's case, usually the many worlds that you create, or the 2 at least, usually at minimum. The next 2 key details really kind of merge into one. See, key detail number 2 is timeline, and key detail number 3 is technology. Technology and timelines are crucial to determining the fine-tuning that'll carve your world into the image you desire. Please decide the time period beforehand so you could avoid continuity errors. This is important to decide because if you move your timeline from the 1700s to the 2000s, many mistakes can be made. Leadership would change, and so would the laws and societal norms of that time period. For example, if I decided to make the time period 1848, and then I decided to write that a character needs to use a phone to alert his friends of mortal danger, it would be impossible because phones in our world had not even been created yet. It's the same concept as if the world was based in a medieval setting, but then suddenly they had light switches, just like common folk, that could turn on and off. But then at the same time, energy wasn't a thing. The world builder just didn't explain where the energy came from. Or maybe common folk, they had this, but for some reason the king or queen did not. These are the kind of continuity errors that we as world builders would like to avoid, if possible, by just adding a slight bit more detail. It doesn't matter if the solution is simple. A simple one is often better than none. Maybe in this case scenario, the world was once like ours, 2025, but after a big, large EMP, the world maybe reverted back to a time before technology. They lost the information on how to create such inventions, and then for some reason, after time, technology began to work again, and now they have electricity, but they don't know that solar panels on their buildings are the things that give them power. So now, maybe when they try to create new devices, those devices lack a power source, and they're confused on how to make it work. And maybe this is something that even requires assistance from another nation, or a specific character that you could build upon. Maybe when it comes to the king or queen not having power in the castle, you could say it's possibly just recently built. Maybe that's why it doesn't have power lines. Or maybe the king had them removed beforehand, because he doesn't trust things he can't understand. Either way, that's 2 great ways of building up your world and the important characters within it without compromising the continuity of your whole story and the integrity of it. Why are environments important? Well, the climate and environment of the planet are some of the most crucial steps if you plan on making it unique. Most of the worlds that I could think of have some type of unique environment that really makes the world around them pop. The purpose of the climate is to really draw in your target audience with a beautiful, fun, or sometimes even harsh environment and biome. For an example, one such that stuck out to me was the idea of floating islands. These floating islands were covered with luscious plant life and had an abundance of flying creatures on them. This could be considered both beautiful and dangerous, especially if you're trying to pilot a ship and navigate past them. Now, because of the scenery alone, I was more invested and able to better retain memories of the movie series Avatar. Another great example would be if I showed a sci-fi fan a picture of a desert planet that has twin suns. Most fans would probably immediately tell you it's a photo of Tatooine. But what if I told you to close your eyes and think of that desert planet, but just change a slight little detail and tell you that, there's an abundance of spice on this planet? That would immediately change the planet from Tatooine to Arrakis from the Dune trilogy. You could even go more in depth with iconic specific locations. If you're a fan of low fantasy and I asked you, what character lives in the cupboard under the stairs? Most people would be able to tell me that it's Harry Potter. I'd also like you to keep in mind that all of the titles mentioned in today's episode are available to borrow at the Ocean County Library. The point I'm trying to make is that an engaging climate, biome, and location are just as important to the story that you plan on writing. Of course, you should try to draw on the reader's attention with a good plot and likable characters, but before even that, you should be setting the scene properly. With an iconic environment, I think there are a bunch of different elements to take into consideration when building an iconic environment. Remember to focus on using details to describe the sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and textures of the place. Let me lay out some of the most important details that could help a place become iconic. The first key detail would have to be color. What I mean by that is that a novel that usually uses like a normal green classic forest, that's not really something that stands out. It's not unique or iconic. Instead, we could try to breathe some life into the world around us by adding a dash of color. We could change that classic boring green to a darker gray or black if we wanted the scene to be more ominous and eerie, or we could do the exact opposite and make it neon and fluorescent. Make it fun and engaging. I'm personally a sucker for a book or movie with some cool looking glowing mushrooms in it. Or maybe we want to foreshadow a war. In this case, we could use the color crimson to assist us. See, this color is often interpreted as, danger, anger, revenge. So if you describe an ominous forest that has red leaves, this can be considered a possible war zone from the past, or it could even be foreshadowing for the future. People can subconsciously catch on to that, and this way, it could help us tie in emotions and invoke ideas from the readers themselves. Even something simple like color changing could be a huge boon to new adventurers making their first attempt at creating an iconic environment. Our second important detail would have to be temperature. Deciding on a temperature can change the theme and vibe of a location. For example, if you saw a snow-covered, frozen biome that chills you to the bone, that's exactly what you would expect of it. There's nothing wrong with an environment like this, especially if what you want is a harsh and unforgiving land. But if you were writing something, low fantasy or just fantasy in general, and you wanted to make it really interesting, something that no one else would do, maybe for some magical reason, the winters of this nation is warm. The snow, which should have been cold, it should have melted, but for some reason, this type of snow didn't. This would really make things more unique. It'd get your mind working, and anyone listening to it or reading it would really try to figure out how that works. Not to mention, it would change how the native people would act, and it would change what the native people would wear. They wouldn't have to wear like heavy coats and big boots if it was warm itself. So it just really changes up the natural theme. A third detail to think of would be weather. Is this a location that's constantly snowed in? Or is this a specific location that's only ever cloudy and foggy, where barely any sunlight shines down upon their citizens? In that case, it could be more ominous. It could be shady, with a lot of alleyways and dark corners. Or maybe you decide that it's like that because the city's inhabitants are all actually vampires who thrive in the night. Or is this a specific location that constantly receives torrential downpours? See, rain could be really useful to work with, but try to build upon it and ask yourself why. Maybe, if it's a fantasy setting, the rain is just caused by angry water spirits who are angered by fishermen overfishing the lake or river. You could always add reasons to why the weather is like that. Adventurers could even use sounds to tie in their environment. Like if someone was in a swamp, a natural sound to tie in would be the croak or ribbit of a frog and the sound of flowing water. Or, if you want to be more ominous, it could be the sound of a screeching barn owl. Possibly you even hear something disturbing the flow of the water, swimming against it. Environments could be elevated even further through these means. Or maybe you decide to make use of smells. The smells that accompany a swamp could be the classic rotten eggs. Or, if you decide to spice things up, maybe the swamp tries to keep people from leaving, and it gives off the slight scent of a delicious, warm apple pie, trying to draw people in for nefarious reasons. There's no shortage of ideas on how to spice up your environment to make it considered iconic. It doesn't even always have to make much sense, especially if you're writing a fantasy story. As a dungeon master, my favorite thing is to rationalize the decisions I make with the rule of cool. Basically, what that means is that even something that's irrational and causes typical disbelief, as long as it's cool, you could just write it off as the effect of magic and find a way around the written rules. For example, in my fantasy universe, there are other dimensions that connect to it. One such realm is the realm of the abyss, which is a really similar concept to Tartarus, if you know from Greek and Roman mythology. It's a scary dimension filled with monsters and has no possibility for escape. However, when my D&D players showed interest in such a place, I decided that if they ever visited there would be an escape room. One that's really complicated and complex, at least for them it was. But as long as they put their minds to it, they'd be able to find their way out. And eventually they did visit such a place, and just as expected, they struggled with it. But they did manage to find the answers and escape through a portal, which then crumbled because it was only a one-time use. I explained to them that escaping the world that had no escape was actually a tear in the fabric of reality that was created through quote-unquote magic. It's something that made them feel accomplished and cool, so I thought in this case it was a huge success. Now, I decided to help you all a little different today. We're gonna do some brainstorming. To do this, I'm gonna try a slightly different approach. I'm going to ask you a question, and I'd like you to pause the podcast and think about your answer. These questions will be based around the subject of environment building. There's no need to worry about your answers. After all, there are no answers in world building that are wrong. I'm going to give you a second to prepare yourself, adventurer, and then I'm going to ask my first question. Question number 1. Let's say we're creating our own world and decided that the world in question had multiple moons. You as the creator could build upon that in a bunch of different ways. What is one way that you would use to build upon it and make it your own? I'm sure you all did great. There's nothing but right answers out there. One idea that came to my mind was that if this was a sci-fi world, maybe the second moon is simply disguised as such, but in reality, it's a large mechanical military base. Or, perhaps if this was a fantasy world, maybe having multiple moons is what makes the ocean so chaotic. Maybe that's why there's a bunch of magical creatures living in there, because the waves are so rush and torrent that it's a more hospitable area for them, and not for humanity. Or, you could even use multiple moons to extend the nights, and explain why nighttime lasts for 16 out of 24 hours in the day. That being said, let's give another question a shot. Question number 2. If I said the world had very little sunlight, and we decided to come up with a reason of why the world is like that, what would you decide? Once again, I'm sure you did a great job, adventurer. A few ideas that came to my mind would be maybe the world has multiple moons, like I said before, and only one sun in the rotation, so the light on the planet is very scarce. Or maybe the locals are nocturnal and night dwellers, so they chose this planet knowing it receives less sunlight. Specific groups of people like vampires or demons, this would work wonderfully for. Or maybe the sun is being blocked by a powerful type of magic, or for some more sinister purpose. With that being said, let's move on to our next question. Question number 3. This time, let's see the scene a little bit different. For this environment, I want you to think of the history behind a land. Let's say the scene is a large city with big walls to keep out any dangers. Then, over the whole city is the skeleton of a gargantuan dragon. The biome itself is desert-like wasteland, but the city itself seems to flourish, like an oasis. What kind of history do you think would accompany such a unique land? Okay, so let's see if your answers line up with any of my own. One idea I had was that the skeleton of the fallen dragon could have been a great guardian beast of the city that had been hunted while protecting them. This would allow the city and its people to have a positive disposition to dragons in the future, as well as dragons thinking positively about them. The second idea that I had was that the city was created when they found the dragon skeleton in the desert. They built their city there so that they could avoid the harsh sunlight. Or the third option that I thought of was that they could have founded the city around the dragon after they hunted it down, because they made their money by mining the bones and the scales of the dragon and selling them for a good price to uphold their fancy lifestyle in this oasis city. There are a bunch of different ways to create lore around a city using history and deciding the morals and beliefs of its people. This will bring us over to our last question of the day. Question number 4. If I said I wanted a fun environment for a mermaid to live in that was safely hidden away from the human eyes, where would you think this city should be created? If you're anything like me, then naturally the first thing that came to your mind was the lost city of Atlantis, an island that is said to have sunk to the bottom of the ocean, where the mermaids would now reside. Or maybe you thought of a bright, fluorescent-looking coral city, right in the coral reefs. Or another idea I had was a village that was off the coast of the sea, one that had been created by carving into the side of a mountain. To get to this city, you would have had to navigate a series of complex tunnels, and unless you knew the secret way to find them, it would be almost impossible, especially since this is a cave full of water. It would be impossible for you to know where to go, as well as to fight the current and get an oxygen tank large enough to make this journey. But knowing their secret, you could find your way by following a luminescent algae that shines only under blue light. I just want you to remember that there are no limits when making an iconic environment. Feel free to let your creativity flow and do your best to tie in one or more topics we've discussed today to elevate your climates and environments. But today, that's everything I had to discuss. Tune in on our next episode to officially dive into ideas on how to create your world's very own map. Okay, so to be completely honest with you, this is my least favorite part about world building. I personally dislike map making and all of the in-depth information that's required or expected of you. I'm generally a simple-minded man. I enjoy world building and elevating the history of a world and its people, but I prefer not to craft the specifics of the world. For example, I don't like to specify the elevation of the mountains or which way the river flows. I'm also not a fan of deciding landmarks or trading hubs of the nations, but this information has the opportunity to be elements the storytellers like yourself can use. However, despite my dislike of the subject, I will do my best to let you know which details I think are important and, the different ways that they could be useful for you. But before we dive into the specifics, first let me cover the different ways to create the outline for your story's map. So, we got map creation. There's several different ways to create your world's map. This just normally ends up being the rough exterior of the map, unless you use an online map generator. If you're naturally gifted and know how to draw, then this is probably the most flexible option available for you. You could draw the outline of the world and then improve it over time. This is a good method for creative individuals that already have a general idea of what shape the world will be and how big the continents might be. However, if you're new and don't want to think too much about the world structure, then you could always use my favorite option. All you need for this is just some uncooked rice. It's simple and easy. All you do is take a handful of that rice and you pour it down onto a piece of paper. After it spreads out, this will allow you to draw around the rice and get your own map that even comes with a few islands. Another option available for you is the creative writing method known as Zines. Although, if you don't want to put in all of this extra work, you could simply look up a good online map generator to help you keep track of the continents, their names, and borders. Certain generators are good for overall worldviews, and others are really more for in-depth cities. I was always personally a fan of Asgard's fantasy map generator for my overall map scheme, and then Watabu's medieval fantasy city generator for more city-related topics. Please excuse me for mispronouncing the names if I did, but I believe that's how you pronounce them. I used the Asgard generator to make my fantasy world's map, and it saved me a lot of time and effort. With the time I saved using a generator, I've redirected my efforts into deciding how the universe itself was created. Your universe could have just been one of the many that were cultivated and needs no extra work for lore behind its creation. But I personally think that's boring. I like to tie in other details that make, the world building itself more interesting and historical in nature. That's why in my fictional planet of Akijan, the whole creation of the world itself was from the body of the supreme god of nature. This is a very shortened lore of my world creation, but the nature god had been betrayed by his closest ally, and a person he called a close friend. This caused him to have a deep resentment toward the realm he came from. So when he fled and found some open space much farther away from this realm, he actually found his resting place, and from his mortal shell sprouted the planet known as Akijan. Now, considering I've explained the typical ways of map making, I will shift our attention to delve into specifics of map making building for enthusiastic creators, unlike myself. The first thing to mention is similar to what we discussed in the last episode, which was about climate and temperature control. As you could guess, the temperature of a nation will shift what plants will grow and what animals will be able to live in the biome. Those seemingly minor shifts can also affect major elements in different nations, cities, trading hubs, and markets in general. Since temperature can shift so many different elements of the nation and cities, I would advise you to start with that. Decide what temperature it will be and how this will help or ruin the ecosystem around the city you create. For example, if you did a desert with high heat, then animals and plants around it will likely diminish. Instead of lush forests, you would have sand, stones, and maybe the occasional cactus. Whereas if you did a temperature simply close to a rainforest, you would have almost endless possibilities for both plants and animals alike. A city in a rainforest would likely flourish unless you decide otherwise. I say this because the temperature and scenery would likely encourage tourists to visit the city. Maybe the city would give tours into the forest to show some different and unique species the nation had to offer. Another reason why the city would do well is because of hunting. I'm sure this is a place where animals are abundant. There'd be plenty of unique pets to be sold, and it'd also be a good opportunity to get extra hide or meat. Any extras could be sold for additional profits. I also think, it's generally just good to think outside of the box. So maybe the forest has unique plants that are sold for special potions or medicines. This will lead me to my next thought, which is water flow. Like rivers and oceans, any large body of water. Like lakes, rivers, oceans, seas, ponds, reservoirs, they'll all change the theme of cities. For example, if a city lives off the ocean, it'll likely have a large fishing population with culinary dishes focusing on seafood. It will also likely be a large trading hub for nations across the sea, because any nation that wanted to get into this continent would likely have to start and pass here. This nation would be even more popular if there was a large river that flowed through the city and connected to the ocean. This way, if someone followed the river, they could connect to other towns and spread the wealth and find new trading opportunities. This development would allow quick new forms of boat travel, and the cities themselves would probably dive into naval warfare and see an increase in taxation opportunities. Maybe even an increase in building or inventing new boats. The next concept that is important in a nation or city, it would probably have to be elevation. See, the height of a town can directly connect to the weather. For example, for those who don't know, the higher you go, the more the heat decreases. Also, those who are in higher elevations, like some cities who have made their homes on the mountains, they typically have less oxygen than those below them. I don't claim to know the science behind it, I just know that's typically how it goes. I also know that the wind increases the farther up you are. So that's something you might want to take into consideration when deciding where to build your nation. I also remember altitude sickness is a sickness that a person could get if they move to a higher altitude too quickly. Once again, I do not claim to know the science behind it, but I would assume it's because of the lack of oxygen. So if you wanted to make a trading hub and then decided on a city high in the mountains, I would probably say that's not the best decision. You could always choose that despite what I say, but it wouldn't be the best decision because it would really limit the amount of tourists and how quickly people could come into the city because they'd need to adjust to the altitude. However, just because a city isn't good as a trading hub doesn't mean the city is forced to be in poverty. Plenty of cities and nations get their currency from valuable natural resources that they can maintain and trade. For example, maybe the city high up in the mountain mines a special type of metal that can be traded for a substantial amount of money. There are several different resources that can naturally increase trade and income for all cities. A few options that I could think of off the top of my head would be precious metals, gemstones, pets, livestock, food, and sources of fuel like gas or coal. There are nearly endless ways to increase the wealth and power of a nation. It's up to you adventurers to minimize or maximize its potential. Another way to do such a thing would be to rely on landmarks that could help increase tourism. These can either be made by people or form naturally through history. This will typically draw attention to the nation itself. For example, in my universe, Solera, it contains a very large tree, probably the biggest in all the realms. This is a tree that the elves live on and take care of. It's known as the Tree of Yggdrasil, and one of the many wonders of the universe that people from across the world travel to see. Those people even stop and learn about the beliefs of the elves while they're there, learning their customs and sometimes even the national holidays. Another crucial piece of information when it comes to map building is deciding how and what nations connect, as well as the travel routes between them. You can make some nations have alliances or wars. There could be uncharted land in between them, or just typical dangerous terrain that holds some fierce beasts. So if someone has to travel in such a place, how do you think the best form of travel would be. Is there a river that someone could go down that'll bring them safely to their next destination? Or is that river infested by some type of river monster? Maybe the best form of travel is by air, and travelers could purchase a ride on a griffin to get from one city to the next. Or, alternatively, maybe they can't get to the city via flying because the harsh winds surrounding the city. The same concept applies for uncharted land. A normal family wouldn't dare risk their lives traveling through uncharted land. Who knows what manner of beasts or monsters might be lurking about? They would also probably do their best to avoid any nations at war because they wouldn't want to be dragged into something dangerous. I want you to also remember that for ground travel, consider what type of terrain the road would be. If the road is paved and nicely laid out, then it'll be a much smoother ride for either a car or a horse-drawn carriage, depending on what genre you're working on. But if the road is underdeveloped, if it's just dirty, sand, rocks, bumpy, dirt road, it's likely to have fewer travelers because no one will want to take the route unless they're less well off. All of these things are just great things to think of before, lastly, deciding the names of the cities and empires, which, in my opinion, is the only fun part. Now, before I begin, I'd like to put a small disclaimer. Please remember, everything I talk about today is purely fictional. They are creations with no connection to any real groups of people. Secondly, I'd like to remind you that the library is an inclusive and diverse environment for all groups of people. Now, let's get back to the topic at hand. Today, I will be discussing the in-depth creation of fictional classifications of people. However, alternatively, you could always use fictional creations that already exist, like those that were written in myths and legends of old. For example, if you wanted your world and its people to have some connection to Norse mythology, you would have access to groups like the dwarves, elves, giants, trolls, and valkyries, and many more. In this case, you could just alter slight details here and there about the group to add your own interesting flavor of change. A good example of this would be like in Dungeons and Dragons. They do that with elves. You have the regular classic elf, you have the astral elf, sea elf, half elf, drow, and eldarin. Now, what makes them so different is where they live and how they adapted to their new lifestyle. For example, an elf who lived by the sea could have learned how to hold their breath for a long period of time. Or maybe, over time, they've managed to develop their own gills that allow them to breathe underwater. Another good example of this would be like how in my universe, Akijan, I reworked how goblins were. Goblins were usually seen in literature to be like crude, evil, cunning, green, ill-mannered, typically gross creatures. And I wasn't really a fan of that narrative, so in my universe, I flipped it around. I made it so that goblins were charismatic, clean, and righteous. They conducted themselves more like knights or paladins. However, sometimes changing minor details like their characteristics isn't enough for a world builder, and for me especially, that was one of those cases. Considering how undervalued and how disliked they usually are, this was the group of people that I decided to completely renovate. I decided to take this one step forward and created 4 different variations, much like how Dungeons and Dragons did with their elves. In my universe of Akijan, I have classic goblins as well as goblin beastkin. These are goblins that like nature and live in the forest, and eventually, because of their closeness with nature in the forest, they develop the ability to transform into an assortment of animals, like bears, deer, wolves, squirrels, and more. Then we have goblin dawnlings. These are goblins who believe in honoring and challenging those with strength. They are the descendants of an ancient, powerful lightning primordial who believed strength meant justice. When I created this variation of goblin, I actually had in mind Byakko, which is one of the 4 symbols of Chinese constellations. Since Byakko looks like a white tiger, this version of goblin has been more bestial in appearance, with sharp teeth, a tail, clawed hands, and scars that litter their bodies. Lastly, we have goblin celestials. These are goblins who have been blessed and have the innate ability to freely control the elements. This special kind of goblin is one that has been infused with the power of the elementals, and because of this, they can control and conjure earth, water, fire, and air at will. That's a few fun variations that I have created based on a group of characters that already existed somewhere else in literature. However, it's highly encouraged to create your own people. I personally feel like there is nothing more exciting than creating a new classification of people from scratch. These are a few things that I would personally have you consider if you want to create an interesting, unique, or exotic new group of people. Starting at the easiest part of the creation process, we have appearance. You first want to brainstorm and think about the rough draft of your fictional group of people. What do you want them to look like? Should they have feathers, green skin, scales, fur, etc.? The sky's the limit when it comes to the creation of your new group of people. However, if I could give you a word of caution, it would be to remember that you want to build them around their environment. For example, someone who lives in a tundra would have a lot of fur to keep them warm. That would also then allow you to decide what innate abilities and skills they could get. The next we have up is general likes and dislikes of this group of people. Maybe this group is all vegetarians, and they love mushrooms that grow in a very specific cave that they live far away from, so maybe they trade for those goods at a high price. At the same time, since they're vegetarians, maybe that means that they also hate the sight of meat or blood. That means they would also probably love nature and its animals and dislike hunting and hunters in general. This is a good way of using traits of a group and their environment to help craft their likes and dislikes. I would then dive into the group of people's alignments. For those who are unfamiliar with this term, this describes a group of people's ethical and moral outlook. Typically, it determines if they're naturally seen as good or evil. After that's completed, the alignment can actually be separated into two categories. The first category is what society and other places view them as, which, disclaimer, isn't always accurate. Whereas the second category is what they actually are like. What I mean by this is if in this fictional world people see angels as good and lawful, then people would naturally trust them. However, that doesn't mean that they're good people. In reality, they could be very different from what the general society thinks of them. They could actually be worse than demons, but that's something you, as the creator, are able to decide. Usually, making a twist of who is good and who is evil is a great way of keeping your audience on their toes. Coming up next, we have languages. If a group of people are known as weretiger, who are furry and feline in appearance, then it might make sense that they're able to speak to other feline animals, like cats, making groups of people unique and able to communicate with creatures that no one else can. It seemingly makes them more useful. The same could be said if someone created a dryad or a nymph that could speak to plants. For those who don't know, a nymph is a creation of Greek mythology whose exterior appearance mimics that of nature. So they could simply have skin that looks or feels like bark, or perhaps their hair is simply made of leaves. Our next topic is common occupations. See, maybe the classifications of people is known for its military prowess because of having renowned strength and honor. Or maybe if they were half spider, for example, maybe they're great at quilting and sewing with their webs. There are countless jobs and professions that could be tailored around the group of people you create. This is based on their beliefs, their morality, their history of their people, their general disposition, or a lot of the times it could just be their special abilities. The last topic I would ask you to be aware of is special abilities. These are abilities that your group of people either developed based on their heritage, history, or environment. What's so fun about this part is that literally anything could happen. For example, if a classification of people were descendants of dragons, then their heritage might have allowed them to breathe fire or grow wings. If I wanted to build upon their history, then maybe their forefathers had messed with the King of Lightning, who had actually cursed their bloodline in vengeance. So in the future, they can never make meaningful connections to people, and anyone that they come in contact with, they actually end up shocking them just from a simple touch. Now that really wraps up everything that I think you should do. However, if you'd like to stick around and listen, I do have a few additional ideas that might help you shatter the expectations of your audience. One such crucial piece of information that I use is what I call the compatibility laws. This will help you keep plot developments from breaking what you designate as canon. This compatibility law would explain if half-breeds are allowed and the general rules of what groups of people aren't compatible to have children. It could also let the audience know if there are any specific groups that come out as only one gender. For example, in Dungeons and Dragons, in my universe, Driders, which are like half human, half spider, Lamias, which are like half snake, half human, and Pixies, which are very similar to fairies, but just more plant-like in nature, they're only able to be born as females. Not to mention, you could also create new groups of people that can only be considered the combination of two others. For example, a Nephilim, which I might have butchered, but bear with me, is usually considered the offspring of a demon and an angel in a lot of games or movies that I've seen. So I put that in. I usually also keep these as secret combinations. I love making combinations like this, and I've created several of them for my own Dungeons & Dragons universe, like I've created Divine Titans, which the players can play as, and it's a combination of a god and a titan. Or Leviathans, which are combinations of a dragon and a triton. Or I even created what I call Lupus Maximus, which is a combination of a werewolf and a kitsune. For those who don't know, a kitsune is almost exactly like a werewolf, but it would be if you could transform into a fox instead of a wolf. I make it so that these all become playable groups of people when a player figures out a combination or shows interest in them. Another additional feature I love to use is magic tiers in Dungeons & Dragons. This also helps me put the occasional drawback on incredibly powerful demi-human children. My typical rule is that the group of people chosen must only include a single magic tier above mortal magic, which mortal magic in my universe is blue. For example, in simpler terms, this means that people like Incubus, who have demon magic, which is red, and Phoenixes, who have red magic, are usually incompatible and are unable to have children together. However, a high elf, who has blue magic, and an Oni, who has red magic, they can produce an offspring. A fun world-building element that I inserted is what happens if a child is miraculously born from two people who shouldn't be able to have children. If somehow a child is born of two groups of people over blue magic, they'll develop a certain incurable sickness that I call arcane overload. This is an illness that affects the raw arcana, otherwise known as raw magic, within their body that they naturally produce. The arcane energies from within produce at such an alarming rate that it can make the person ill and fatigued. This is why the character and or players need to monitor and discharge their magic accordingly, depending on what kind of potence that the magic is. So it'll be in different increments. Like if it's just red magic plus red magic, it'll be like every 24 hours. But if it was something more like red magic and gold magic, that would be every 12 hours. It could be something that is seemingly annoying, but also good for roleplay developments, or especially good for writing, of course. This is something that my Dungeons & Dragons players personally love. They use this element for role-playing, and it makes them feel cool. Because if they're red magic, for example, they're able to release a bolt of pure red, arcana-like electricity into the air. Or they could even store it and use it to power up their next spell and give it like a reddish tint of lightning, and it does more damage. Now, before I begin, just like last episode, I would like to put a small disclaimer. Please remember, everything I talk about today is fictional. These beliefs, cultures, and people are creations with no connection to any real group of people. Second, I would like to remind you that the library is an inclusive and diverse environment for all types of people. Now, let's get back to the topic at hand. Today, as you most likely guessed, will be spent discussing the in-depth creation of fictional beliefs and cultures. In this episode, I will briefly explain the steps on how to create your fictional belief system for this world and based on each specific group of people. Now, step 1 is what I like to call, who are they? I always start by thinking about who the people are who will be serving under this divine figure. For example, when I personally think of elves, I think of a group of people who live in the trees. With this information, I can conclude that the belief system that they would practice likely would have to include nature in some way or form. Using that thought process as my base, I then move to my next point, which is who they worship. Another example would be if my chosen group of people were Aquan, which is a fictional classification of humanoid aquatic life forms that live off or in the sea. This would include a variety of different people depending on what type of world you plan on creating. For people who play Dungeons & Dragons, this might include sea elves, tritons, water genasi, or maybe even wereshark. Whereas, if you wanted to use generalized myths and legends, you could rely more on mermaids, selkies, sirens, water elementals, or, my favorite, you could create your own group of people. However, despite their differences, they would all likely want a belief system that would be akin to them, meaning something that they could worship while submerged in water. This would likely cause it to have similar traits to their own, meaning it would be an individual who could breathe underwater, and they would likely have beliefs that mirror their people. This means that for the weresharks, who are vicious and believe might makes right, they would want a being that is powerful and nearly unbeatable as their deity or divine figure. What I would think of is something more unbeatable, like the Kraken, Leviathan, or maybe even a Hydra. These are all beings capable of mass destruction that the weresharks would find liberating, whereas more peaceful individuals like mermaids, they might worship a being more like Moby Dick. This is a unique whale that in some versions is white with red eyes and aggressive to sailors. However, the spin that you could put on it is that maybe the whale is only defensive, and it only attacks sailors when the ship gets too close to mermaid population. That way it's not actually just an aggressive being, it just wants to defend, and it gets aggressive when it needs to defend them specifically. Step 2. Who are they? Driving deeper into who they worship, this is where things could get a little bit tricky. You have to ask yourself, is this a god, goddess, mystical creature, item, or landmark? Let's continue with my previous thought about the elves. I think that they would either worship a god or goddess of nature, or, alternatively, worship the trees, or maybe one giant tree themselves. I personally am a fan of Norse mythology, so my mind went straight to the tree of Yggdrasil. That's why in one of my universes called Solera, I had the elves worship the tree of Yggdrasil, which, as you could guess, is the most important tree in Norse mythology. I even took it one step further. I had these elves live on the tree and take care of their leaves and branches. They treated the fallen leaves, branches, and apples as offerings from their deity, which would help supply and protect their people. See, in my universe, elves are renowned woodcarvers and were the first to lead their way in the creation of wands as conduits and instruments for magic. They would use the branches to create magic conduits, which is the exterior wood of the wand that, after adding a magical core, like the single tier of an elemental, it would make witches and warlocks able to cast magic without it rebounding the spell on the caster. The elves would then tend to the tree and its largely profitable golden apples accordingly, whereas the tree's leaves were used to create special cloaks, robes, and clothing. Step 3 is morality. This would help explain what the group sees as good versus evil. If I were using the basis we set up so far, then maybe since the elves in my universe worship a tree, they would be against the use of fire for fear that it would harm their deity. In this case, morality and beliefs would have them identify fire as some type of evil or sin. Another interesting way you could use this is by changing their expectations of how to meet someone for the first time. This can heavily differ depending on what most people consider normal. Meeting someone for the first time for the elves might include some type of offering that ties into the great tree that they serve. For example, something like offering arcane Hydor, which is actually spelled Hydor, and for clarification is the Greek way to say water. Perhaps this magical water is a sacred ritual for the elves. Alternatively, you could use a saying or a phrase instead of an offering. For example, something around the nature of, "May the tree of Yggdrasil's light fill your home with a pleasant warmth, and its bark protect you from harm's way." This could be as vague or detailed as you decide, but I think short and sweet is always the way to go in world building. After all, there is always seemingly so much left to do and so little time. Step 4. Rules. After you figure out what is considered good versus evil, as well as what their expectations are for what behaviors are considered proper and improper, you can next begin to build upon their general rules. Some of these rules can easily be created using what we learned from what they consider good versus evil. For example, I could build upon that dislike and distrust the elves have for fire and create a rule that no open flames are allowed within the presence of their ancient tree, Yggdrasil. Or perhaps another rule has been created by their distrust of other groups of people. Maybe they don't believe that the humans will honor their beliefs and properly take care of and revere the tree. So they keep them from walking upon its branches and their cities that have been built upon the tree. Using the layout of the elves and their beliefs allow us to create specific rules that could either protect or harm their people. After all, not all rules are considered a positive mechanism. History shows time and time again that we'll have to correct the mistakes and injustices of the past. So having a rule or two that should be changed or removed reveals a deeper and more humanistic, unique approach when world building. Step 5 would be hierarchy. It's always possible that a belief system has multiple steps towards moving up in its churches or orders. This part is always a little bit more difficult if you want to make it more realistic, because usually this means that not only are the titles required, but also descriptions of what the titles entail. For example, there maybe are steps to advancing your faith. The first step might be a devoted follower, then a priest, then a Templar, and then maybe at the top, a minister or champion chosen by the tree itself. The cool thing is that you could really decide whatever you want the ranking and titles to be. It doesn't have to correlate to reality and their descriptions if you don't want it to. Your ranks could be something that correlates to the person or object of worship. For example, if I wanted the tree's ranks, maybe I'd make it the life cycle of the tree itself. So I could start off the title as seed, and then move to seedling, then sprout, then sapling, then tree. And the final honored rank could be something mystical, something special, like ancient ent. There could also be ways to speak to higher up members by using honorifics or specific phrases, like saying, by Yggdrasil's roots, to bless them before or after a conversation. This will help it seem more realistic and draw parallels from our own experiences in the real world. Step 6. Special events. Building upon a fictional belief system can be a difficult thing to manage. I personally like to insert world building with casual elements that make the audience aware of their culture and its beliefs without forcing it. A good way of doing something like this is with a fun special event or holiday. For example, in my universe, Solera, we know that the elves worship the tree of Yggdrasil. So naturally, I worked on a holiday for their people that I have named the Twilight of Fallen Petals. This national holiday celebrates the harvest of the fallen leaves and branches of Yggdrasil. The elves count it as their object of worship, Yggdrasil itself, providing wealth and prosperity to the elves and the magical community because they use that wood to craft wands and the leaves of the tree to fashion that into cloaks. This holiday is often seen more of an elven-run tradition by the elves that live on Yggdrasil. However, many other groups of people come in to appreciate the beauty of the holiday and the fluctuation of new goods on the market. See, the elves began to make it more of a huge festival, where they would wood-carve wands, staff, canes, in front of a crowd of interested onlookers. This way, they could take popular on-demand orders and tailor the experience to fit the general magical population. Side note to keep in mind when it comes to creating special events, I would urge you to include a date. It's always good to add a date or relative time for events so that you could spread them out over the year. For example, the event The Twilight of Fallen Petals I created is typically a week-long event that takes place during the second week of October. This way, it doesn't conflict with other holidays I have created and spread out, which take place in January, April, June, August, and November. The seventh and last step that I have is current beliefs. This is where you could add information about the current leader's beliefs. Maybe the current leader of the elves had something that happened in their past where someone stole something important to them. This would have made the elves have a stronger than normal distrust and dislike towards any people who were labeled as thieves. Maybe this is why a strict rule about thievery appeared, and now people who thieve and steal are treated at the same level of actual criminals. Or perhaps the leader of this order is new. Using this element, you could remove unjust rules or overrule decisions that the previous leader had put into effects. The current beliefs of the people are allowed to shift with the times, and so can their leaders, and this is what makes it more realistic. Although that's all I have for today. But I would be ecstatic if you could join me in the next episode, which will cover how to create an administration. Now, before I begin, just like last episode, I would like to put a small disclaimer. Please remember everything I talk about today is fictional. These administrations and organizations are creations with no connection to any real-life groups of people. Secondly, I'd like to remind you that the library is an inclusive and diverse environment for all groups of people. Now, let's get back to the topic at hand. Today will be spent discussing the in-depth creation of administrations. This episode will briefly explain the steps on how to create your administration for your desired world and provide good tricks to employ within this organization. Diving into this head-on, let's start with the most pressing question that we must have answered. The first question I always ask myself is, what kind of ruler does this administration have? I know this is generally a broad question to ask, so let's try to narrow it down a bit further. To be more specific, let's ask ourselves, what title does this ruler hold? Is this an administration run by a monarch or a king who rules its lands, or perhaps it's the opposite? In my world of Akijan, the Orc Empire is led by a matriarch. For those who might not know what that means, a matriarch is a woman who rules or dominates a family, group, or state, much in the same fashion as a queen. I actually use this matriarchal society to build two different, conflicting parties within my Orc Empire. Normally, the first child of the matriarch would have become the next ruler of the nation. However, since for the first time since their founding, this child was born as a boy, most citizens and other nobles rejected this child's claim to the throne. So, of course, the next following years, most people only focused on the next few children born, who were all women. Now, they had to compete for the throne, but while they were doing this, another faction was rising in secret. This faction had named itself the Sword of the King, which showed their loyalty to the son who had been the firstborn and, in their eyes, the rightful ruler. From there on, you could delve into disagreements, family ties, conflicts, resolutions, and trauma that could have resulted from that lifestyle. I personally chose this method because it adds a good flair of realism and allows my audience to pick a side, or alternatively, maybe they decide that neither side should be fit to rule. After all, you could always shift away from a single person deciding everything and elect a presidential figure. This would allow you to create special events or elections and make more use out of councils and senates. Now, continuing step 1, after finding out what the title of the ruler is and what it means to its people, is to figure out who that leader is and what they will become. What I mean by this is, just because someone is born and raised to be good doesn't mean that they will be. After all, trauma and betrayal can create scars that won't heal. So, someone who started off as a good person and was raised for greatness won't always reach their full potential. For example, this firstborn son was most likely raised to be a kind and good king, but if they were betrayed by one of his sisters, then I'm sure he would have trust issues that are hard to overcome. Those trust issues can lead him to doubt the motives of genuine allies, or isolate him in the long run. Remember, situations like this could always make or break a leader, and that is something I want all of you adventurers to keep in mind when creating your nation's ruler, or multiple rulers, if that's what you decide. Up next, I would consider the laws your nation will uphold. It's always good to have general thoughts on what laws will work best in your world. If you were in a world with both magic and mortals, hiding the fact that magic exists, you would most likely have some of the following rules. Probably something around the lines of no mystical familiars can be summoned in the lands of mortals. They most likely would only want you to summon familiars that would be considered normal, quote unquote, in the world of mortals. So this would be something that doesn't catch the general population's eye. This would be something if you had a familiar that was like a dog, like a golden retriever. Whereas if you tried to summon a mystical creature, like a phoenix familiar, that would most likely be seen as blasphemy and an open breach of the rules that have been set. Another good rule would be magic would be restricted in the lands of mortal. For example, in my universe of Solera, spells are only allowed to be cast if the witch or warlock has been sent by the church, military, or noble house. You likely can only cast discreet spells when sent by someone in a position of power, especially for specific quests or missions. You wouldn't be able to use your wand freely. So you wouldn't be able to cast, really flashy looking spells, general things like that. You wouldn't want to look odd or eye-catching to a mortal. However, not being able to use magic at all would make it completely almost impossible to capture rogue magical creatures, if that was your mission, per se. So, in times like this, they would probably allow mages to cast spells through their familiars as a temporary conduit for magic. Alternatively, if they were sent to heal an important mortal with magic, and that place for some reason didn't allow animals inside of the building, like some hospitals or something, then it would be smart to have the mage exchange their wand for a cane. A cane would make the magic and mage in question look a lot less conspicuous. However, regardless of how the spells are cast, the witch or warlock in question would have to avoid being seen by mortal eyes. So, if they were somehow actually seen when they weren't supposed to be, this is when, in my universe, that the Erasal Task Force, run by the Overseers Inquisitors, would come in to erase the mortal's memories. Another rule would be that magic items cannot be obtained by non-magical individuals. You're not allowed to leave, give, sell, or gift anything that is naturally magical or from the magical world to a mortal. This is seen as a huge liability and can damage the relationship between mages and mortals. If this is somehow broken, once again, the Erasal Task Force would be sent to wipe the memories of the mortal and reclaim the magical item. The Erasal Task Force in my universe is seen as critical, but no one but those in power know if this job is just a myth or if it's an actual existing profession. Try to keep in mind that the rules for administrations can differ, and there are often multiple sets of rules that need to be followed. For example, the 3 rules I've spoken about previously are all rules that have been sent by the ruler of this nation. However, if the characters or character in question were also students, then they would most likely to have to follow whatever school rules there were as well. For example, the rules in the School of Solera, one of 6 magical schools around the globe, consist of the following basic rules that a student would have to follow. Rule number 1. New spells will be practiced under teacher supervision. Number 2. Do not wander past the warded fences. They're there to protect students. Number 3. Do not try to socialize with the Wendigos. They are dangerous and hungry. Rule number 4. All disagreements will be resolved through duels. Rule number 5. Flying after 10 p.m. is forbidden due to worm dragon migration patterns. And the last and final rule, familiars are for defense only. However, if the character was an adult who had graduated, then they would only have to listen to the default rules set by their nation's administration. Although, in a low fantasy genre where the magical world is hidden from mortal eyes, I would encourage you to set more rules that will help keep the audience from poking holes in your world's logics and rules. A good example of logic notwithstanding criticism would be if you wanted to make a challenging scene where a character's family member was in danger and needed their help. You, as the storyteller, wanted this character to take some type of mortal form of transport, which is obviously much slower than magic, to add suspense. However, it would be difficult to add this to the story if the character in question had a dragon familiar. In that scenario, if they wanted to escape from this crowded mortal city, then what's stopping them from just finding the highest building away from mortal eyes, and then summoning their dragon familiar to fly away? This would be a scenario in which the audience can see clear flaws in your planning, but if there were restrictions set in place for flying forms of travel, then they would once again be stuck and unable to summon their familiar and fly away. To streamline this logic behind my world of Solera, I created accepted forms of travel according to the laws set in place by the magistrate. These forms of travel are heavily restricted and regulated by a corporation known as MOVE, which is short for Magical Official Voyage Insurance. And, obviously insurance is spelled with an E, not an I. It is unnecessary to register land animals or vehicles due to lack of risk. However, to provide an avian, which is air, or aquan, which is water, form of travel to either yourself or to another person, to a magical vehicle or creature, you need to have an ATP, otherwise known as an arcane travel permit. To qualify for this permit, you need to be at least 16 years old, and this permit expires every 3 years. You also must be screened for magical color. People with black magic are unable to travel and have to report to the magistrate to find better forms of travels for criminals, because black magic is unnatural and only is the result of corruption and decay. You also need to acquire a valid registration with the Office of Arcane Excursion. A worker from this office will come and inspect the magical beast or vehicle that will transport the mages or goods. If the magical creature or vehicle is deemed safe and orderly, they will issue you your registration that'll last for 3 years. And to renew this registration, it costs 3 Electrum Drachma. Now, the next step in creating an administration is to delve into the land of politics. You could always have 2 parties with conflicting views to add drama and conflict in your universe, or you could make it so that there's only one belief system with no easily found flaws. In this scenario, you can make it so that it's more of a mystery, to find out what's going on in the government and find out what they're possibly hiding. A great example of this would be in the show Avatar: The Last Airbender, in the great city of Ba Sing Se. It makes it seem like it's the perfect city, and no one says anything poor about it. However, you find out that's because they use hypnosis under Lake Laogai to make the city appear perfect. Ultimately, it's up to you, the creator, to decide what's best. I would like you to please keep in mind, however, that all of these titles mentioned in today's episode are available to borrow at the Ocean County Library. The following step is a bit trickier, and it covers concerns of citizenship. This is something that could be a world-building element that shows how new species join a council of aliens that have evolved far beyond the human race. It could be as easy as taking a picture, or as futuristic as taking a whole scan of the person, or maybe as advanced as needing to study and take tests. It also helps when attempting to create councils. See, in a lot of good stories, storytellers create a council of most powerful individuals. This is a good option for a magical world to separate the council members based on their specialties and types of magic. The number of council seats would depend probably on the variety of different magicals you have created. For example, in my universe, the world that I created had miracles, which are seen as passive combat spells, combat magic, which is obviously combative spells geared towards fighting and defending yourself from harm, white magic, which is geared towards healing magic and helping people with mental health, then lastly, familiars experts, which is someone who's very knowledgeable in familiars and an expert at catching them. That would fill 4 seats in the council. But I don't like 4 seats because when deciding to pass something, a bill or something in a council, it's always better to have an odd number of people. Therefore, the 2 sides won't have even numbers of votes. So I went one step further and I included a monarch, which is the most powerful and influential mage of the time. That way there would be a total of 5 seats on the council. The last step off the top of my head to mention would be creating military or police rankings. In my magical universe, I actually have 3 sections, of different police groups that uphold and protect the laws. So, Section 1 is handled by the prothesis, which is protector in Greek. They enforce the general rules, much like the police. So they would handle witches and warlocks who attempt to break the law. Section 2 is handled by the epivolis, which is enforcer in Greek. They're a group of specialized wizards who hunt down and capture rogue mages. This is an elite task force put together with direwolf mounts. Section 3 is handled by the kaignos, which is hunter in Greek. They're a group of specialized hunters that capture rogue monsters. Please keep in mind that I really might have butchered how to say those words, and don't quote me on it because I did my best with Google Translate. But that's all I have today, adventurers. I hope you enjoyed this episode and tune back in with me next month when you dive into how to create general lore for your world. This portion will help cover the general world lore of major and minor cities, as well as nations, which will include their holidays, special events, sports, languages, and prominent figures. Using these broad details will allow us to build a sense of connection and commerce within your world. I know I've spoken a little bit about these topics before, so feel free to use that as a base and this as the building blocks. Alright, adventurers, let's start by breaking down what we have heard in the previous episodes. If you have taken my advice, you would most likely have created something for the following topics. You have determined your genre and timeline, created a map, and have gone in depth on climate creation. Using your environment, you built upon these ancient lands and created your classifications of people and their personal beliefs and cultures. After establishing that, you launched into building the rules and regulations set by their administrations. With all of this planned, you should have quite the in-depth world on your hands so far. If this is your world-building knowledge and it was just a rough sketch, getting this far is quite the accomplishment. But we are those who seek exquisite world lore, so naturally we push onwards towards more extensive details. To start, let's look over some holidays and natural events that don't correlate to any one specific classification of people. These are holidays that will be accepted and celebrated around the globe, not just in one specific nation or one specific group of people like we have previously discussed. I think most holidays are celebrated as cheerful events, or holidays that honor important memories of the past and those who have fallen. For example, in my universe of Solera, I create an event called Festival of the Fallen Stars. This is a holiday where seers gather around to do divination rituals and see into the future. These rituals are glimpses of what the year will hold by looking at the stars and using astrology. This usually is celebrated as a large masquerade ballroom dance. This way, if someone is given a great or poor fortune, the rest of the crowd won't know the name of the person who got such a fortune. This allows the mages to preserve their freedom and individuality. This event is usually held on August 25th. Although I think cheerful holidays are vital, I would also encourage you to use the opposite, which could be important depending on how dark you want your world to feel. For example, I have an event in my world that falls on the solar eclipse. This solar eclipse will trigger all magical creatures to enter this state of frenzy. That is why every solar eclipse is carefully monitored, and even the friendly familiars must be locked away securely. During this time, all missions are postponed, and specialized shepherds are used to redirect creatures of darkness away from mortals. This is because, in my universe, shepherds are those who have special affinity for things that go bump in the night. They can connect with magical creatures that others run from, like banshees, boogeymen, and wendigos. For this reason, they are hired to round up and herd these creatures away from larger civilizations where they could put people at risk. You could also implement holidays that exist in real life and just make slight changes to them, or add special details to enhance the event. In my universe of Solera, I use the holiday Day of the Dead. This holiday involves family and friends gathering to pay respects and remember friends and family members who have died. However, since my universe is full of magic and wonder, this day is celebrated in special ways by hiring mediums to help loved ones connect with the dead. In my universe specifically, this celebration is run by the Morrigan family because they have innate special abilities that help them see and speak to the dead. Then we move on to special events that are celebrated just as enthusiastically as holidays, but aren't done on an annual basis. A good example of this would be one of the events I created called the Ceremony of the Rising Sun. This is a rare ceremony that is celebrated when a white magic color mage is discovered. This is incredibly rare because to be born with white magic is a 1 in 100,000 chance. So, when a person does manifest white magic, the event is represented as the birth of a new noble who is considered to be part of the royal family. Regardless of their status or birthright, the individual is given a royal title, house, and fief of land. Next, we'll move on to sports. You could always use existing sports in real life, or you could make your own sports. In my magical universe of Solera, I created a sport based on boat racing. This sport is conducted by sailing 2 large sailboats through mermaid and kelpie-infested waters. This is a challenge because the aquatic creatures will do everything in their power to try to stop you. This is why you could use your own familiars and spells to either move and protect your boat, or you could damage the other rival team's ship to make them sink first. Because the first boat that crosses the finish line, or the last boat standing, is the one that wins the match. Another fun sport idea in the magical universe that I thought of was using track and field and merging it with magical elements. So the goal is to get from one side of the building to the other. However, the use of familiars and items is banned to make sure that there's no unfair advantages. What's cool is that magic spells, however, can be used. For example, individuals could use force magic to create additional jump pads, fire magic to blast themselves forward, earth magic to make stepping stones, enhancement magic for speed boosts, and transmodification magic to transform into an animal, like a bird, monkey, or something else to speed up or outmaneuver your rival. We are going to continue the world building by creating prominent figures. I personally love stories when the author adds lore of popular individuals that aren't crucial to the story. However, even though these little details aren't relevant to the story, they breathe life into your world. For example, I love the idea of using Harry Houdini's name in my magical world lore. I thought of this narrative that Houdini was a letdown in the magical community. He was a terrible mage and an even worse student. He would terrorize his teachers with unorthodox pranks and get in a lot of trouble. However, due to this creativity and unorthodox skills, he became the best escape artist in the realm of mortals with his death-defying stunts. Another interesting idea that I had to use was if we used Leonardo da Vinci, the famous painter. However, what many people didn't know is that when he received the praise saying he brought his art to life was correct. Da Vinci was a sculptor, a person with the innate ability to manipulate materials and breathe life into them. Now, remember in your universe, you are allowed to bend history a little bit. So let's do that here. Let's say he created masterful works, but none that can match his statue of Alexandria. This is a statue of his lover, who had fallen sick and passed away when they were young adults. This mystical creation can walk, run, talk, make facial expressions, but it seems to be unable to smile or laugh. Most scholars think it's because of her developing depression issues over the loss of Leonardo da Vinci himself. He named this work of art What Should Have Been. And as for the location, I would say it's best to probably put it in a school academy garden or maybe a museum. As a dungeon master, I personally like to include various prominent people like this because it not only enriches the world lore, but also leaves something for the players to use and build upon. For example, now if my players were to visit that garden at the school of Solera, they would be able to find Andrexia and talk to her. Maybe they could even relieve some of her depression and help her find a new direction to take in this lifetime. Please keep in mind, when it comes to using the names of people who exist in our real world, you have to be careful. There are several legal and ethical considerations to keep in mind. After all, you do not want to write anything that can be copyrighted or seen as defamation. I personally like to play it safe and only include people who have been deceased for over 100 years. After creating prominent figures in the history of your world, I would then delve into how you want to handle languages. What I mean by this is that you could either use one language that all people use, which is described as a common language, or you could create your own hypothetical language based on each group of people. For example, an orc in Lord of the Rings would speak Orcish. This isn't a real language because it hasn't been built upon or fully developed. However, there are instances where actual functional languages can be created in works of fiction. This is usually done when a fictional language is developed using actual vocabulary, grammar, and syntax. A great example of this would be the language Klingon in the Star Trek universe. In many types of languages, especially fantasy worlds, they tend to use the names of classification of groups as the main contributor to their language's name. Like I mentioned before, in Lord of the Rings, Dungeons and Dragons, and many other fantasy novels, Orcish is the native language of the orcs. The same could be said about Elvish, which is the language of the elves, and Dwarvish, the language of the dwarves. Using this logic, the language a werewolf might have is werewolfish, although I personally don't think that rolls off the tongue well. So in cases like this, we can either take a single part of the name and make it wolfish, or use the scientific name for a wolf, which is Canis lupus. Alternatively, we could use only part of that scientific name and make the language they speak known as Canis or canine. However, you could also just throw all that logic to the wolves quite literally and make your own name for the language in question. After all, you're the master of your own world. Next up, let's discuss a few common mistakes that writers and world builders end up making. One mistake is that, this is really the biggest mistake and most common too. It's using too much world building details. What I mean by this is if you focus too much on environment building and in-depth descriptions, you tend to lose sight of the story you plan on telling. The same goes for if you give too in-depth explanations on a culture or group that has no importance to the plot. It's interesting to create a whole functional language in your world, but if it's a language no one speaks and has no relevance to the story, then there's really no reason for you to build upon it. The second most common mistake would be homogeneity. Can you imagine if no one in a group or organization has a divergent opinion, appearance, or lifestyle? Like everyone agrees. There is no outcast or a skeptic or someone in conflict with where they belong. Have you ever encountered a culture like that? That would be completely unrealistic and break the flow of what we consider possible. But that's all I have. Tune back in with us next month when we continue our quest for in-depth world building by building our very own currency. This portion is one of the more boring topics to build upon, in my personal opinion. I dislike money, math, and counting, which is strange considering how often you have to do them during Dungeons and Dragons. However, despite my preferences, don't be dissuaded because it can become an invaluable asset to your world depending on how you use it. Now, the best way to start is by considering what type of money you would like to use. Would the world that you're building use the Earth's real currency, like the US dollar or perhaps the Japanese yen? If you would prefer to use a system that has already been created, then that's totally okay. You could skip the tedious process of creating your world's currency and instead focus on other topics within your story. However, please keep in mind that if your characters decide to travel from one place to the next, you might have to use currency conversions. For example, if your character lives in America and they decide to travel to Tokyo to defeat their rival or enemy, then they would have no influx of money to use. The character in question would be unable to use the US dollars in this scenario, so they would have to convert their US dollars to Japanese yen. However, keep in mind this won't equate to the same amount of money. Typically, in this case, the US dollars is worth more than Japanese yen, so you would gain additional money by converting US dollars to yen. Please keep in mind that this conversion is always subject to change, so double check yourself to see if there are any changes to this. However, if you decide you did not like the idea of converting our real-world currencies, or you just wanted to create your own currency, then I would encourage you to think over these few details that I'll be discussing. Let's start this simple. Is there any connection between the world you're creating and the real world? If so, then I would encourage you to start by using part of money that already exists and then build upon it in new ways. What I mean by this is that all around the globe, we have various types of currency, and each currency has a different form. So let's start by saying, for example, our world we planned on using originated from Japan. Then we would likely start with the Japanese currency, but then backtrack it to whatever time in history we desire. After all, it doesn't have to be the current Japanese yen. Their forms of currency seem to constantly shift in different shapes, styles, designs, sizes, and materials, including gold, silver, bronze, and more over the history. What I would take by this, and normal fantasy worlds, is that they both use gold and silver, so as long as we use either the bronze or copper, then we should be good to go. We could also allow it to be a circular coin with a hollow square inside the middle, but perhaps this is where we deviate from the norm. In exchange, let's say that we decided to make this hollow square a different shape, like a triangle or a star. It can even be a different shape depending on the value of the coin. Or perhaps you decided to swap the symbols and letters engraved on the coin to dictate the meanings or names of the royal family in your world. Doing this would allow you to honor an existing currency and change it in a way that fulfills your own needs. For my first universe, I played it safe. I stuck to a regular Dungeons & Dragons currency, like gold, silver, copper. There was nothing wrong with this, and it fits well with the high fantasy universe that I was trying to create. However, for my second universe, I decided to go outside my comfort zone. I thought about it, and I pushed myself to use an existing form of currency that correlates to the mage's origins. Naturally, for an ancient magical society that came from ancient Greece, I had decided to use drachma. Then I went one step further and created my own special type of metal that was used as the highest value drachma coin that was called Boricium drachma. This special currency was never discovered by mortals in this universe, and because of this, it is incredibly rare and expensive. In the occasion that you want to make your currency from scratch, I would encourage you not to include conversions in your world unless it's going to be a very important element that you add to your story and you plan on telling. After all, with conversions, currency has the potential to complicate and convolute a story. Also, what I would encourage you to consider is that when making your currency from scratch are these three things. First and most important detail would be what form of currency do you plan on using? Do you plan on using what the US dollar bill does, which would be linen and cotton, Or would you like to go a different way and use a coin-based structure? Or perhaps you're in a sci-fi universe and you'd like to use something similar to like a credit card. The second detail to consider is what type of material do you need? What I mean is that if your community and currency takes place underwater in the sea, then you'll most likely have to have a type of material that won't rust, corrode, or break away. Perhaps this could be as simple as a sand dollar, or as special as coral, or a rock found deep within the sea. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe the community lives above an active volcano. In that case, perhaps this currency must be heat-resistant metals, like tungsten, which has a high melting point. Or perhaps it's a special currency made from compressed volcanic ashes. The third and last detail to consider is its worth. What is each form of currency worth, and why is it worth more than the others? A good example of this is how, in our economy and in fantasy worlds, a gold coin is always worth more than a silver coin. Their worths are determined by the supply and demand for each type of material and how it's made. So, of course, gold is going to cost more because of the smaller supply and demand from the general public. Since we have created a solid foundation for our currency, let's dive into how we should use it. We should typically create at least a general idea or list of prices for common and extravagant goods. Keeping a general thought on the prices of your universe will help keep continuity and overpowered items away from your players and or characters if you're writing a story. You don't want to make something too cheap or easy to locate in a generalized shop because then they'd be able to buy and acquire it immediately. For example, if what they're looking for to combat their terrible nightmares is a lucid dreamer potion, then it would likely not be cheap or sold at a general store. In this case, they would most likely have to go to a specialist or a specialized shop like a potion shop or an alchemy store. It also helps to know the prices because if you didn't set up the prices beforehand, then a character could buy, let's say, a dragon from a stingy shopkeeper, and you might have given them way too good of a deal. In this case, that stingy shopkeeper might be interpreted as a generous person, and it could ruin the scene you had planned. Then the characters or reader would question why that happened and possibly try to look further into it, where there's no way to go. It's typically best to avoid these situations so that they don't occur and break canon. As a dungeon master and world builder, I would encourage all of you adventurers to decide prices for what's important in your world. In my world of Solera, it is a world hidden behind magic in the real world that we live in. So I made prices for general goods, like clothes, accessories, camp and travel supplies, like a tent, sleeping bag, water canister, and stuff like that, as well as the prices for foods and drinks. I also broke it down into different sections that would dictate what the prices for good food was, like a 5-star meal versus poorly made food, or something like jerky. Also, since my world revolves around familiars and taming creatures, I added prices for tiers of familiars, for regular, common creatures, as well as like magical, fantastical beasts, and their gear, like collars, saddles, and kibble. Lastly, I added in more of magical elements, like gems, herbs, potions, staffs, wands, and new types of metals that I had created that can be used to hold magical enchantments. However, when it comes to charging money for potions and herbs, you have to be careful. I say this because you don't want to leave continuity errors or opportunities. Let me provide you with an example of how this could create a continuity error. In Solera, I have a potion called a persuasion potion, which grants the user increased odds of winning an argument or persuading someone to do something. If someone drinks this potion, everything they say becomes a persuasive argument due to the change in the frequency of their words. People say that their tone of voice makes them sound like honey. Now, because of its useful properties in my universe, this is worth 12 platinum drachma, which is a good chunk of money. The ingredients include various amounts of acorns, cardamom, ginger, hibiscus, Irish moss, and lastly, siren mucus. But if the price for the ingredients alone costs 13 platinum drachma, then it's impossible for the potion to be sold at such a low cost. The same can be said for the opposite. If the herbs or other ingredients for the potion are very cheap, then it makes no sense for the finished product to be so expensive. One exception to this is if you have to do a lot of work to prepare it, or if it's on a specific time crunch or constraint to finish. After creating the currency, its worth, and general prices of what materials are worth, I would encourage you adventurers to dive into occupations. If an energized potion that a watchguard needs to drink to stay awake is 1 silver, and his mortgage or rent is about 80 silver, then he would need at minimum to be making around 111 silver a month, because 1 silver over a whole month is around 31 energized potions that he would need. By that logic, without counting food or anything else, that's what he would need for himself and his family. He would also likely not be able to go out to eat at night at a fancy restaurant that cost any silver pieces, which also means that bribing a guard to look the other way or let someone into the building that he was guarding would at least require a few months of rent to risk the guard losing his job. Another way to do this is to pay a person based on their skill and what they provide. So, if the least skilled carpenter or apprentice got paid around 30 copper for the chair that they made, and the best skilled carpenter got paid around 30 silver for the chair that they made, that is a huge difference. The difference is decided by their skill, experience, and title, but it would be comparable to their needs to survive in this economy. They can't be making so little money that, they can't afford to eat or have basic necessities, because that wouldn't create a very functional society. I would also like to mention that the people who have a highly desired job or fill a role that not many people are willing to do would bring them a higher influx of pay. So what it comes down to is deciding what occupations are worth what in your world that you make. If your community that you are developing has an abundance of monsters, then the guards would likely be paid more than the typical person. However, if your community is built on a river, then maybe fishermen are more common, and that means that boat builders would be a more lucrative job opportunity because they are needed to build their boats. My last advice is to create new occupations geared towards your world. These can be current occupations that exist in our real world that you alter to fit the role that you want. The contrast, it'll make it more interesting. Let me provide you with an example. If I told you that my dad was a pirate, you probably wouldn't think too highly of them, right? However, in my universe, this profession is the opposite of one might expect. In this universe, they are well-respected and honorable warriors who have a high honor code and protect the coast from sea monsters and powerful entities like that of the Hydra and Leviathans. After hearing all of that, a reader or player would most likely change their opinion on that individual or profession. Although that's all I have for today, adventurers. Tune in on our next episode as we delve into fun, extended lore ideas that your world technically does not need, but can benefit from. This episode will have various topics and ideas that can be crafted into interesting world lore that'll help the world that you're building seem more unique. There are various ways to extend your world's reach, and one of the best ways to do so is by building world lore that isn't technically needed. What I mean by that is if you have listened to my other episodes, you have likely created everything that you need to forge your own successful world. This episode will contain details that aren't technically required to make a world run, but they do add a bit of fun lore and spice for your audience. This information that surrounds the world and the story, but takes place in the background, is typically what I consider extended lore. In most cases, this will include names, organizations, and rankings that enhance the general world lore that you're trying to build. Let me give you an example to start. Let's say that I was making a story about teen mages who are learning to use magic under the safe watch of school professors. This story typically wouldn't need much external information other than what they read in textbooks. However, if we wanted to add a bit of flair, then we could include little snippets about other arcane academies. This helps build a broader world that seems more realistic because it shows this isn't the only academy available. These newly mentioned academies will give brief insight into other school opportunities and maybe explain why students were so lucky to attend this school instead of the other ones. In my first high fantasy universe I created, school was a foreign concept. The only people to receive formal teaching were nobility, so this was something I didn't even bother building upon. However, in my second universe of Solera, my Dungeons & Dragons players had the opportunity to start playing their characters from back when they were teens enrolled in school. Since the players opted for this experience, I ended up detailing school structures, teachers' names, and other information like other arcane academies. However, if a school isn't even part of the story you plan on telling, that's also fine. In this case, you could use this detail to highlight some of the characters' background elements to, a graduated student or maybe someone who was just recently hired or interviewed. All of this extended lore really depends on how in-depth you'd like to go. I'll start by giving you an example of how to create good school structures and decide on different locations to build a school. For my universe of Solera, this magical universe takes place hidden behind the normal world we live in. What I mean by this is that I had to decide where to build the magical academies, but I knew they must be built away from the mortal population's eyes. I had a few ideas on how this could be achieved, but I decided on these locations because of their iconic nature or well-hidden areas. The first and most important one for me was the main academy that my players attend, which is called Solera. This academy is one of 6 and is simply known as the most diverse and inclusive school offered to the magical population. This fictional school is ranked number 3 out of 6 and can be found by traveling through the Niagara Falls. After being escorted through this waterfall, you'll find yourself at a huge plot of land that is rumored to be a deceased behemoth. This land is full of giant sequoia trees, making it nearly impossible to navigate to the school other than a single river channel that leads inside the body of the land, straight to the school. The other schools I will go down in order of rank to simply describe them, starting at rank 1. At rank 1, we have the school known as the Magisterium. This building is well hidden within Athens itself and is considered the Greek branch of the academy. This prestigious school and its students tend to think they're better than everyone else because they live close to the origin of magic. They are quite obnoxious, however, because their students end up being elite spellcasters that eclipse other schools in comparison. This is partially only because the families that could attend this school are the 24 noble progenitor families. At rank 2, this leads us to the Amaterasu School of Magic, hidden within Hokkaido in Japan. This Japanese high school for magically gifted students is one of the most popular schools in the magical world, especially because they have the financial backing of the 12 noble vampire families. This school usually prioritizes being in the mountains and has the goal of bringing peace and harmony between nature and the kami, which kami are otherwise known as gods. They believe that those who are born with magic have been gifted by the kami and must use their magic to uphold tradition and serve and protect. Therefore, their curriculum usually revolves around defensive magic as a priority, along with alchemy, Reiki, and undead studies. Since I've already explained rank 3, which, is Solera, we'll dive into rank number 4, which is the Atlan Ascension Academy. Located in the Amazon rainforest, this school is for those who love water. They naturally produce the world's top water mages. They specialize in seamanship, diving, and magical marine biology. Anyone who graduates from this school is seen as a leader in white magic and aquatic life. They get hands-on experience with joint training classes with mermaids that teach them all about life underwater. These students start by raising koi, goldfish, and catfish until they're experienced enough to go on their first fishing trip. During this fishing trip, the mermaids actually help the new students catch their first magical aquan familiar. At the very end of their school career, the students are then blessed by the guardian of the mermaids, which is actually a juvenile leviathan. Rank 5 is up next, and that academy can be found within the Black Forest in Germany. In this school called The Grove, that's for those who are in tune with nature. They admit students who are considered green witches with a green thumb. The teachers work closely with dryads and ents to preserve nature and make sure that they are not affecting the forest and their inhabitants negatively. These students mainly focus on herbology, potion making, and alchemy as their required courses. The school produces reliable, open-minded students, but the students lack the power and funding to be considered the top 3 schools. Lastly is the school ranked number 6, which is known simply as the Fingari, and it is hidden within the Appalachian Mountains, and is seen as a tribal school full of mages who don't have much contact with the rest of the world. They are typically seen as nothing more than barbarians by other magical users. After being admitted into the school, students are split up by their strength and put into separate tribes and clans. It is also rumored that the school has a terrible status which is frowned upon by the majority of mages. This bad name for the school is a touchy subject for their students, and so it's encouraged not to ask about their school or home life. Now, after that long example of different schools and general world lore, let's dive into the structure of a school. Each school will have its own parameters on what the rules are and what they have to enforce and what the school itself looks like. What this means is that, there's different ways to build upon it and have fun with it. For example, in the Academy of Solera, this school has listed various different classes and locations within the school. Since my school is both magical and more medieval style, I ended up coming up with some interesting locations to build in, much like an armory for smithing, a wand crafting room, an animal farm for non-magical familiars, and the kennels, where they house familiars that are smaller than 8 feet tall. Then you have things like the gateway, which is one long hallway where you could enter any number of magical artworks that lead to a different location within the school. Or you could look at the portal realm, which is located outside in the middle of the courtyard. Here there are large archways made from the wood of Yggdrasil that lead into individual clearings. These archways are made by the elves and are marked by the strange, exquisite runes carved into their frames. A mage only has to pump their magic in, and it opens up its own seemingly separate dimension that's able to store magic creatures in their natural habitats. And then lastly, we have buildings like the Colosseum, where duels are supervised by an instructor. Now, let's take a darker turn and look at some of the hidden horrors within your world. If you have conflict in your world, then you likely have people who are considered both good and evil. For these individuals you deem as evil, you'll likely need a place to lock them up, much like a prison. How would you personally build this prison? Is it a lot of small cages that simply add up to one big one in the long run? Or do you have multiple different locations that store a couple mages at each location? Or just one really big one? In my world of Solera, they lock up any rogue witches and warlocks who have committed crimes or have used dark magic. This prison I personally use is 3 different floors, all of which that appear differently than the last. These floors can even change shape and appearance depending on the current time. The first floor is reserved for people who are high-class citizens or have connections in high places, like the noble families. These are where minor criminals who haven't used dark magic or committed grievous crimes like murder stay. Unlike the other floors, these people are unchained. They have no prison cell. It's more like one large room that has transformed itself into an individual realm, like a small forest. It has a beach inside with water to swim, and is refreshed daily by draining the magic out of the prisoners, making them unable to cast spells. The second floor is where the majority of people are put. If they have committed any crime less than murder or the use of dark magic, here's where they go. They're thrown into this cage that has the necessities to live, like a toilet, bed, sink, and shower. However, this is made of reinforced and enchanted see-through glass and silver floors. Much like the first floor, magic is siphoned out of the prisoners. Although this one, it's a little bit more harsh. It continues to siphon magic until they come very close to passing out. They are then often patrolled by familiars like Wendigos outside, so that if a prisoner manages to somehow escape, they meet a pretty grim demise. Then we get to my final floor, which is the third floor. This is honestly a place of horrors. It is layered with spells to keep prisoners in and is often patrolled on the outside by powerful familiars. They are thrown into a small cell where they barely have enough room to stand, and they're delivered food once a day. These prisoners have a ball and chain attached to their hand that drains magic. They can, however, leave through the large gap in the back of the cave if they're strong enough. Those who leave are subjected to the horrors of reality. They go into a world where they're forced to fight and hide to survive. This small realm that is created for this prison is about the size of 8 football fields and gives off red light shining above that puts any familiars in the area into a fit of rage. This leads us to our next part, which is how to create ghosts and their classifications. Let's say that I was working on a world building project that is a bit spookier in nature. It involves a lot of ghosts, and if I wanted to build upon this, I could separate ghosts into different categories other than just a poltergeist. I could say in my world of Solera, I've detailed several different versions of ghosts and what they're able to do in the real world. Let's start with a simple one. This is called a mimic, otherwise known as an echo. It could copy the voice of whatever creature they haunt. They're known to be able to lead mages into danger and take great pleasure from causing discomfort. Luckily, these ghosts are only able to make sounds. They can't maintain a form, move objects, or possess a being. And obviously, they are considered evil because they get their joy from leading people into these dangerous situations. Now, every mage knows that they should be on the lookout for doppelgangers and mimics because both of these creatures can mimic the voices of friends and loved ones. They are often employed by dark mages for escape purposes and to leave threatening messages behind. The administration and law enforcement do not hide their disdain for this type of ghost, and because of what this ghost could do, it leads other mages to be more weary of ghosts in general. Next up, we have phantoms, otherwise known as deviants. These unwelcomed ghosts are usually in places that they don't belong. These ghosts have no ties and often drift from place to place, causing trouble and mischievous natures. These ghosts are the type to likely go rogue and become a poltergeist. They are known for their mischievous and childlike wonders, often causing mages to be annoyed. They are often in it for the laugh, and sometimes people report them as malicious in nature and a terror to be around. They are one of the ghosts, however, that are able to convince other undead to go haunt other places or people, since they can have conversations. Next, we have poltergeist. These are ghosts that have gone rogue. In this state, a ghost is able to manifest itself into the physical plane, meaning that it could touch or hurt somebody. They are also able to move multiple objects with ease and forcibly possess a person's body. They are considered vulgar and evil. These creatures always actively seek to harm the living. Ghosts of this caliber are to be hunted down and exterminated by a specter squad led by a special unit of clairvoyant mediums from the Morgan progenitor family. This leads us to shades. These ghosts, otherwise known as shadow people, are spirits of people who are unable to be seen. Due to their embarrassed nature and inability to handle anxiety during their life, they are unable to be seen other than out of the corner of your eye. Other than being shy, they are often seen as creepy, since it seems like they watch people from afar and appear when you least expect them. Most mages tend to dislike shades because of this, but in reality, they're quite pleasant individuals who seek to help people. They often point out lost items out of the corner of people's eyes and are seen to interact fondly with animals and pet them. They are often found in the school, hiding away in the kitchen where they cook for the students, and then they come out at night and clean. Next up, we have specters. These are ghosts that are tied down to a specific area, item, or, in rare cases, a person. They are humanoid in nature and give off a pale, ghostly white or blue aura. Because of this, they're generally easy to spot, other than if the specter in question is a paragon. For paragon specters, these rare individuals are able to retain their humanistic features and coloration. Their dispositions tend to vary because it depends on how they were when they were alive. Some ghosts don't even know that they're dead. As for how useful they are, they could do various different things that mages ask them to. They are, however, limited to the amount of distance that they could go from their tether. This tether could be an item like a necklace or a person or something stationary like a statue. These are usually seen as the most productive type of ghosts since they could talk and interact rationally with other mage kind. In the School of Solera, the principal employs several of ghosts under this classification to guard the school from prying eyes and stay vigilant to keep out other types of ghosts. Then we have wisps. These are spirits that are unable to manifest a human form. What this means is that they could still interact with items and move them, but they're unable to change into like a humanoid shape or possess another being. They seem to be unable to communicate because of this lack of a humanoid form, but they can change colors to signify basic answers. Green is documented to be yes, red is no, and blue is general confusion or not understanding what's being asked. As for their disposition, not much is known about them other than the fact that they enjoy being given work. Since they are unable to talk or interact with living beings, they seem to crave attention and praise when delivering messages or supplies. Most wisps tend to work for the corporation Wisp Warranty, which is a major contributor to delivering all sorts of goodies. Now, if you wanted to build upon this even further, using those different types of ghosts and their abilities, we could form separate organizations to sort the majority of ghosts into. This would give ghosts of your world some type of meaning and motivation instead of just leaving them as stagnant individuals in your story. In my universe of Solera, I make use of 4 major ghost corporations that make the world more unique. The easiest one is always the one to create that's seen more so as evil. In my universe, the evil one of the 4 ghost corporations is called Spectral Ruin. This is an organization full of demented ghosts that actively try to harm people and work with dark mages. That's because evil ghosts derive their power from people's fears, anxiety, and depression. For this reason, the organization is seen as evil, and the Shadow Legion, which is a different corporation I'll be mentioning later, is often sent to deal with these kind of ghosts. As one would expect, this organization is considered illegal, and any members of this organization are to be taken into custody for question and then exorcised. The second organization would be Wisp Warranty. As I mentioned briefly before, these ghosts lack a humanoid body shape and would go mad with boredom if it wasn't for working at the post office and delivering mail. Delivering these packages and other supplies seem to be the only thing that give them purpose. This is a legal business that has been approved by the administration, as well as the Move Corporation, which gives them a 5 out of 5 star rating. The third organization is simply known as Spectral Reconnaissance. Considering they could easily hide and are unseen like ninjas, they are excellent at gathering information, finding people's locations, and checking in on loved ones. One of their most popular services is to actually hire a private inspector. And yes, that is a play on words for, a normal private inspector, just spelled differently like specter. I thought it was kind of funny. Their most popular thing, though, to hire a private inspector to do, though, is to confirm suspicions on infidelity or find out where someone is hiding. This is a legal business that has been approved by the administration. However, legality only applies if this information is gathered in a public sector and the ghost did not trespass on private property. Ghosts who break this law are to be excommunicated or exorcised immediately. And the last and final organization I have created is called Shadow Legion. They are the only beings other than an exorcist that could clear the way for an unwanted ghost. After all, there is no other way to beat a ghost than with another more powerful ghost. The term ghost hunter and ghost exterminator were actually created based on this profession, where ghosts of deceased knights and honor-bound individuals who have passed away continue fighting and protecting their household and families beyond the veil of death. This is a legal business that has been approved and endorsed by the Prostasis. This organization is led by the legendary knight simply known as Galahad. Now that we have wrapped up the segment on ghosts, the last section I will be discussing today in our extended lore podcast episode is how to classify pets and general animal companions in a magical universe. This will help break down animals depending on their skills and general usages, as well as help create a basis on how much they should cost because of these details. Now, you could use real existing non-magical creatures, or you could use magical creatures that exist in mythology, just because it's that much easier. They already exist and they've already been created. Or you could go above and beyond, and you could create your own magical creature. A good way to create your own, if you're interested, is to simply combine two creatures and make it some type of hybrid chimera creature out of it. To make things simpler for my players, I created 4 different tiers of animal companions for my Dungeons & Dragons world. It goes in order from weakest and least amount of money required to buy to, what I think is the most skilled animal companion. Coming up as the first tier, we have house pets. These are animals seen most commonly as house pets. They don't tend to have any combat-oriented skills and can't really protect themselves from danger. These creatures are usually small in nature and used for more of emotional support and companionship. A good example of some of these creatures would be things like cats, gerbils, bunnies, squirrels. They're also the most affordable in the fantasy realm and usually cost around 2 copper to a maximum of 50 silver. The next and second tier we have would be utility. These pets are what some people use to extract resources from, much like a cow gives milk. Or it's a type of animal that could help them with a specific job, like carrying something. They're typically much like house pets. They don't have any combat skills and lack, the ability and mental prowess to protect themselves and their owners. A good example of these animals would be cows, donkeys, sheep, and their prices are usually around 80 silver to 3 gold. Up next, in third place, we have scouts. Pets from this category are meant, just like their category implies, to scout out and track prey, or help deliver people to that prey quicker and safely. These creatures usually have a small number of abilities and have keen senses. They vary in size, but come usually in small to mid-sized creatures. A good example of these animals would be birds of prey like hawks or falcons, or other animals like a fox, a hound, or a medium-sized horse, which is able to safely deliver them to whatever they're tracking. They also end up being more expensive. Their prices start usually around 75 silver and raise up to about 15 gold pieces. Then, lastly, the tier that I use to complete it is called the warrior class. And as one would expect, these pets are usually made to guard and fight alongside their masters. They usually defend themselves and take orders well. Their sizes typically vary from medium to huge, and a good example of these creatures would be jaguars, griffins, and manticores. They are often usually more expensive as well, with babies of these creatures being sold for as low as 3 gold to as high as 450 gold. However, that's all I have for today. I hope I was able to open your eyes to a little bit of the possibilities. I know that I definitely didn't cover everything that Extended World could cover, but I just gave you a couple of examples how I've used it over my personal worlds, and how you could really use them to enrich your universe. Feel free to tune in to our next episode and final episode, where I will be discussing how to connect your universe to other possible realms. Alright, so let's say that we have all this other world building information complete. Your world is fully created and structured with a bunch of fun and unique details. Your audience will most likely be very engaged in the story and the universe you have created, and this is a great thing. And if your story takes place on Earth, then you likely won't have to create any more additional information. However, if you made your own world from scratch, then the audience might ask you how this world came into existence. See, for specific situations like that, you might want to do a bit of brainstorming and find out how this realm came into being. Your options for this would also vary depending on what genre you chose. For example, if it was a sci-fi world, then perhaps the planet itself was created on the back of one giant asteroid. Or another fun option for sci-fi is that the planet itself could have been created by its residents who built this metal planet from scratch. Although if we were in a high fantasy setting, then maybe the planet's formation is a bit different. Instead, you could use elements of magic and wonder to create the world itself, and then tie it into your world's history. For example, what if the world itself was created when a leakage of magic from other realms had gathered up in this location? So this random location in space, all of this raw arcana from the magic of other realms, had kept on piling up and condensing so densely until it officially gained a physical form. You could tie this into history as well of the planet and say that the people of your universe have strands and abilities of magic of the other realms. Not to mention, it would also be a wonderful reason to why your world's citizens have the highest aptitude for magic in all the realms. Or another good example for a fictional world you adventurers have created to use is, a pantheon of gods. Let's say that one of these gods, a god of nature, had passed away. You could use this as the base of your universe. From this god's body sprouted a whole world and ecosystem that your citizens now live on. Now they revere and give thanks to the fallen god. With this narrative, it would be easy to also create, links to prominent figures, create historical events, and even holidays. The main thing I want you to keep in mind is that most places, even Earth, have their own history and lore behind its creation. Now, this lore doesn't always have to be super interesting or tie heavily into the world and narrative or even be vocalized, but it's important for you as the creator to know. It'll help you as well to prevent unintentional continuity errors and give your universe a more enriched world to work with. Please keep in mind that you can still create your own history surrounding the creation of your world, even if you were to choose Earth. For this fictional narrative, you could include ways that magic flowed into our world. A lot of popular manhwa, manga, and anime use the power of dungeons to manifest magic into their fictional versions of Earth. That way they could still use the layout of Earth, but spice it up with fantasy and sci-fi elements. A dungeon is usually a brief connection into a different realm that is filled with deadly magical creatures and dangers lurking at every corner. In some forms of literature, these dungeons can be closed, and in others, they're just permanently present. But regardless of what you've chosen, they could be a useful element to bring in just a dash of magic into your world. I also technically use this parameter in my fictional universe of Solera. I wrote that in my world that there are many theories and hypotheses of how magic first came to be. However, the most plausible theory to the magical community is the narrative that magical beasts began spilling out of this dimensional rift called a dungeon. And when magic first touched our universe, due to these pesky magical creatures and monsters, the population immediately declined. The veil that protects the human world from magic, it was stretched thin and overrun by the sheer number of monsters spilling into the earth. That's why even mortals could see these monsters from legends, folktales, and myths. The world was terrified and not strong enough to hold off such powerful creatures without the use of magic. And that's when the world began to shift, and higher powers beyond mortal means had seemingly bestowed powers upon selected individuals. From this setting, I created several different theories on how people gained magic, so that my players and my audience are able to make their own assumptions. Theory 1 was that magic was infused in the air, and that the strongest newborn babies were born able to withstand its might and become the world's first mages. Theory 2 was that being attacked by a magical creature was thought to trigger arcana to rise to the surface in mortals. Mages of the time thought that the strain of being touched by a magical creature would push its body to the limit, and the individual would either absorb a bit of the magic or be consumed by it. And my last and final theory I created was that due to starvation, mortals were forced to hunt and eat magical creatures, and this caused mortals to die, but those who had remained and survived became the first witches and warlocks of the times. I want to take some time and reiterate all of the fun monthly events that the Ocean County Library has to offer that you adventurers might enjoy. Please keep in mind that even if you listen to these episodes years after they're recorded, many of these programs will still be ongoing, and you might ask yourself, after all this time, yes, you should always check our calendar of events to find a group near you. The Ocean County Library offers adult writers groups for creative writing at multiple branches. If this is something you're interested in adventure, please keep an eye out for a group near you. Not to mention, we offer fun programs for teens called Dungeons & Dragons for Teens. This is a wonderful experience for young adventurers. Players who are 13 to 18 can join an adventure in the wonderful world of Dungeons & Dragons. More information on exact dates and locations can be found on our website, theoceancountylibrary.org, under the calendar of events. Also located on our website, you could browse our numerous databases that could help you with your world building and storytelling. 2 databases in particular I would advise adventurers to look into would be Udemy and Universal Class. These databases have excellent courses for writers who would like to learn and polish their skills, as well as various other fascinating courses that you might be interested in. Now, adventurers, grab your anvil and hammer because it's time to return to forging your imagination. Now, since I explained how dungeons work, Let's go over some other ways you could connect your realm to other dimensions. To start, we want to think of a separate world that connects to our own realm that we have created. Is this a different universe that will be completely fleshed out, or is it just a simple world that we created to elevate our own? For example, you can make something very in-depth like Dungeons & Dragons does, where you connect the prime material plane with somewhere else, like the Feywilds. This seemingly parallel world is the origin of the Fey creatures, such as the Seelie and Unseelie Fey, Eldarin, Pixie, and Satyrs. In this realm, they have their own set of politics, rules, and regulations that differ from the prime material plane that most players play on. Or, if you wanted to do something very simple, you could just make it a realm that is normally impossible for other individuals to go to. A good example of this would be like how in my universe of Akijan, I connect it to where the fire and ice phoenixes come from, which is a land called Hitokoraki. This dimension, also known as the Land of Phoenixes, is a world that is uncomfortably split in half. One side is freezing temperatures where ice phoenixes seek refuge and hide away from the fire phoenixes, and the other side is a blazing fire and floor covered in molten magma. It is rumored that the fictional deities of my world created this specific realm in honor of Holwolf and Kwolf, which is the fire and ice gods when they were born. The natives of this land are fire and ice phoenixes, fire and ice elementals, and same with ancient dragons. People from this realm are born with an innate, rare burgundy color magic. So, considering the temperatures are either incredibly hot or incredibly cold, it is impossible for normal people to survive these desolate landscapes. Therefore, this realm is, a nice element to connect to my high fantasy realm of Akijan, but it's not as if my players or audience would be able to experience that realm in close proximity or detail. That little bit of distance helps me from having to build too many details into that realm's history, nations, or heritage. It's also important to decide where this tether or portal to another realm is located. So, if you guys decided to use Earth as your starting point, then were to connect to the fiery hot side of Hitokoraki, then the portal cannot be found somewhere too densely populated or too cold. The most plausible area to create a tether would be somewhere hot and not easily seen, like that of an active volcano, or buried somewhere in the middle of the desert. Whereas if the realm you connected to was frozen and icy, then you would want to make the portal or gateway somewhere like the Antarctic. This will hopefully also allow you to spread out these tethered realms in different locations around your world's map. It could also be used as a reason to why these specific locations are so hot or cold. Or maybe you could say that the other realm spills out some of this magically induced weather and it overwhelms what the Earth naturally creates. I personally like to spread out my tethers to other universes across the map and connect them to places that are similar to where they live. This way, I can introduce new classifications of creatures, people, and culture into my world organically. Just like how in my universe of Akijan, the only connection to the Abyss, which is like my version of Tartarus, is found deep within the mines of the Yarnoth Empire that have been long abandoned because of how dangerous it is. Information like this adds exciting new possibilities for the audience to explore even after using everything that your world has available. It's not something absolutely necessary for every world builder, but it is something that I encourage you all to look into and, really decide whether it's for you and for the world that you're creating. If you do decide to tie in another fully fleshed out realm to your own, then I would encourage you to create prominent historical figures from both worlds, as well as powerful bloodlines like royalty that would make it possible to include a family tree. This will make the worlds seem more unique and also naturally provide some culture that will trickle out from both worlds. If you connected a world of magic to that of the Earth, then it could be a worthwhile investment to make real-world connections and references that'll tie into the world you're using. A good example for this would be if I used the famous name Charles Darwin, but said that he was actually a mage that came from another universe. This magical tether, we could say, in their realm, everyone knows of the name of the rune caster known as Charles Darwin. His knowledge of creatures and evolution are exquisite. His breakthroughs are so grand that the magical community itself has commissioned a new floating library filled with his books. In fact, it's because of him alone that the magical community has a tier list for when it comes to familiars. He created the tier list and its ups and downs while evaluating each creature. This way, it stays true to the history surrounding the Earth, but also adds a flair of fantasy and magic. Another good example would be like using someone like Beethoven. You could say that he was always a famous musician. However, after the accident, no one was able to see like he could. He could predict the future like no one else. He was also able to accurately, single-handedly help the magical community escape mortal danger, exposure, or end a war. Although it wasn't always like this. Now, you see, with this narrative, we could say that in the beginning, his skills as a musician were good, which drove people to ostracize him and envy him. That's why no one was able to predict who cursed him and stole away his hearing. But, to their dismay, only after he lost his hearing did he truly flourish. It's all because of that lost sense that he was able to enhance his sight and see in a new way, and see beyond. I think that the family tree would also be a solid element to invest in. As I mentioned before, the more detailed the family tree is, the more important they'll likely think that the characters you introduce are. This will help you narrow down your audience's interest in select families, as well as show why they are or are not important. So, if someone very important from a different realm were to show up, then naturally this realm's, version of nobility would try to accommodate them and roll out the red carpet, so to speak. You don't even have to mention the whole family tree unless it's important to you. Instead, you could just drop in specific names and some of their accomplishments as time goes on. I'll give you an example of a family tree I have created from my universe of Solera. I have created several families that are considered nobility in my universe that would have the presence to demand hospitality. One family would be the Merlin family. And as you could guess, this family is the descendants of the great and powerful wizard known as Merlin Ambrosius. As for the lineage of this family, it is long and tiring, so I focused on the last couple of generations. I typically go back 4 to 6 generations prior to the current timeline, which allows us to know who the current head of the noble family is, who their parents are, grandparents, children, and forefathers were. So, for the Merlin family, the oldest log that I have is from 4 generations ago. I kept track of each family member and the heads of each families, as well as other family members who were not chosen to lead, but were wed into other families. The same goes for if there were any tragic deaths that caused, someone to discontinue the bloodline. These details also helped me solidify which noble houses were connected. But that's everything I have to pass on to you all. Adventurers, I hope you enjoyed our journey together and that you have learned some valuable knowledge and skills. Just remember, creativity will live on and flourish even in the darkest sections of our minds. All you have to do is take hold of that creativity and forge it into something of your own desire. This is Thomas Stoll of the Ocean County Library signing out. If you are hearing this message, you've officially listened to the entire podcast series, and for that, I would like to thank you. I hope I helped you adventurers grow that creative ember into a blazing inferno. And although this is where the podcast comes to a close, just remember, much like metal heated from a forge, world building can be melded, changed, improved, and tempered. You only need the will to do it. If you've enjoyed this podcast series, please take a look at some of our other OCL Soundwave podcasts. Feel free to leave us a rating on Spotify, Radio Public, and Pocket Casts. Most importantly, keep that imagination forge lit and have safe travels, adventurers.